So, all right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Pride commemoration event from the City Gender and Sexuality Research Center. I'm Koen Slootmaeckers. I'm a senior lecturer here at City, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you today in this event with two of my dear friends, Dr. Francesca Ammaturo, who is a senior lecturer at University of Roehampton, and Dr. Olimpia Burchiellaro, sorry, I did that probably not so much justice, who is a postdoc at the University of Westminster. And the idea of today is to have a bit of a chat to reflect on, okay, what is Pride Parade? The last couple of years have been quite tumultuous when it comes to Pride Parades. I think COVID has changed quite a bit, with most Pride Parades being cancelled and rethinking of what the actually all means. So we thought it would be nice to just have a bit of a reflection about where we are with Pride. Now, I guess as most of you know, Pride started about 51 years ago or so as a commemoration of the Stonewall riots of '69. And as you can imagine, since that, over that 50 years, a lot has changed. We've seen the impact of neoliberalization, of the kind of movement from queer liberation ideas to a more homonormative LGBT rights kind of idea. We've seen in many places commercialization of Pride parades with a lot of companies. If I think about the London Pride, which is more companies than people, but also we have seen a lot of contention around Pride parades in different areas in the world. So I'm thinking Black Lives Matter protesting the presence of police and states within the Pride parade, contentions, and the kind of reclaiming of where does trans lives fit within this Pride as a kind of forgotten part of the community, but also the tension between queer ideas, queer liberation, and homonormative ways of looking at LGBT rights. And so all of that, obviously, it's all happening already, and there's a lot we can say about this, and I'm sure Francesca and Olimpia already have a lot to say about that. But then with the pandemic last year, most Pride parades suddenly got cancelled, and I think that also brought together this moment where the taken for grantedness of Pride parades in certain places kind of got suddenly questioned or on a very unequal footing. And I think it also then raises question, okay, what is it that Prides do? What is the space that Prides take? What happens if we move to virtual events? We've seen a lot of virtual Prides. I see some people here on the call who worked hard on the virtual World Pride, for example, which was, or the Global Pride it was called, I think, which is a tremendous effort, but also does a lot of different things than the physical Pride does. So that as a kind of an introduction as to where this conversation potentially could be going. So the format is really, what I'm going to do is just give the floor to Francesca and Olimpia for the first 5 minutes each or so to give their reflections, and then do a bit of a Q&A, as I called it amongst ourselves earlier, a conversation with friends. But I also want to make sure that all of you are part of this conversation. So please, if anything that is being said by Olimpia, Francesca, or myself raises questions, or you want to come into, for starts, you can put them in the chat. But the idea would be that after about half an hour or so, we open the floor for a more interactive session. If the conversation is ongoing at 5 o'clock, we can stay a bit longer. But that's kind of what we're doing. So enough of me talking, because I talk too much. So either Francesca or Olimpia, the floor is yours. Whomever wants to go first. Francesca, oh, Olimpia, you go first. There we go.
Okay, I was gonna ask, do you want to go first, Francesca? But I'll go for the sake of this not turning into one of those things. Well, thank you for your lovely introduction, Koen. So I think in order to sort of start off the discussion, I kind of wanted to first give a bit of background about my work and maybe like who I am. So I guess in my PhD, I looked at the politics of diversity from like a critical perspective, and as you'll see, like that's kind of that is relevant for how I also understand these questions, especially with regards to commercialization. Now I'm currently working on a leveraging trust postdoc kind of research project that is ethnographic, exploring, I guess, the complicities and resistances between global corporations and local activists in the global south. So my first field sites will be Kenya, and I'm also happy to sort of like talk about that in relation to some of these questions. But also, I guess for 5 years now, I've been involved in a number of campaigns, but specifically one campaign, which is, I guess, fighting to open London's first community-owned late licensed queer pub to replace, and it's called the Friends of the Joiners Arms. So you should like check it out, and maybe some of you already know it, hopefully. And I guess the reason I'm kind of contextualizing it in this sort of with this introduction is, I think, because this sort of theoretical impetus, I guess, driving and tying some of these things together is sort of an interest, a kind of an anthropological interest, I guess, in how to conceptualize this relationship between sexuality, capitalism, and LGBT politics. Like what, you know, not just I guess historically, but also like particularly in this kind of current moment in which like multinational corporations are very kind of interested in specific kinds of like productive and valuable forms of difference. But also the kind of political impetus is kind of how to mess with this relationship. So there's kind of a tension, and also like a nice, I would think of as a nice kind of combination of both theoretical and sort of political sort of agendas, so to speak. So I guess I kind of, in preparing sort of a short introduction, I'm going to share, you know, they're very messy thoughts, but I think there's a few things that I wanted to touch on that I think might be a useful way to like kick off this kind of conversation. And I'm not answering any specific question not as much as like just kind of offering my thoughts on sort of different issues. But I think what I wanted to start was sort of what we might mean by commercialization. So sometimes we kind of use this word, but you know, what does that mean? And sort of what exactly are we talking about? And I think when we talk about commercialization, we might mean, I mean, certainly some of us do mean that, the sort of how corporations or private organizations are increasingly kind of sponsoring Pride, becoming major funders of LGBT events and or organizations. Certainly I've encountered that in my fieldwork sort of in Kenya, for example. But also we might sort of talk about sort of the commercialization of, you know, LGBT identities and queer spaces as well. So there's like kind of a slightly different kind of emphasis perhaps on the latter sort of thing. And on this, I think I've been particularly interested in looking at the ways in which commercialized, again, forms of queerness have aligned with gentrification and other like exclusionary projects in various ways to sort of displace undesirable, unproductive others from the kind of spatio-temporal imaginings of the city. But I think more broadly, and this is sort of an understanding of commercialization sort of that I'm developing, is sort of thinking of commercialization as something that encompasses perhaps maybe more subtle things. So for example, the process by which increasingly, I think, corporations, not the state, is petitioned and imagined as the like dispenser of human rights and protection. And I would say particularly in places where the state is actively denying that protection, which I also think is like an interesting thing to think of in relation to like queer critique, perhaps. But also sort of this is something that maybe has been sort of spoken about more, is kind of the way in which thinking of commercialization as like the reconfiguration of queer activism around specific kinds of like professionalized career queers. I borrow this career queer term from SM Rodriguez's wonderful ethnography on Ugandan sort of activists. But also like kind of, and therefore there it becomes sort of thinking about the implications of both these things, which are kind of really both sides, two sides of the same coin, for the kinds of issues or politics that become thinkable and or intelligible as pride. Like what is pride? What is there to be proud of, etc. So those are the kinds of questions I've been interested in. But I think also on this note, and I think increasingly, I've been interested in sort of what we might call, kind of following Sarah Schulman, this sort of commercialization of the mind. So I think like this is something like that I always find quite interesting to reflect on. But like during my PhD, I was faced with like quite an interesting question, which was like, how do we reconcile the queer critique of pinkwashing, sort of like, you know, we probably know that, we can talk about that, with the fact that, for example, some people I spoke to during my PhD were genuinely like fully excited and moved by corporate displays of LGBT friendliness. Like they were genuinely like, you know, happy and excited and moved again by being able to march at Pride with their HSBC rainbow t-shirt next to BAE Systems. So genuinely moved by what we perhaps understand as maybe kind of maybe superficial slash and or kind of a maybe underwhelming ways of thinking Pride. So from an anthropological perspective, my question was like, how do we account for these kinds of intimate investments that queer people make in capitalism's promises, however like cruel and or fleeting and or unattainable, without sort of resurrecting this like really problematic image, I think, of like queer people as like duped, fooled by hegemonic forces, as like people who cannot understand their own oppression, like without sort of resurrecting those kinds of images. And I think sort of that is both like interesting for me, but also kind of worrying, because in the sense, I think the challenges of decommercialization are perhaps way more serious than just kicking corporations out of Pride, because they actually have to address how we can decommercialize like desire and notions of progress and all that kind of stuff that is like perhaps more complicated. I don't know. So those were kind of my thoughts on commercialization. Sorry, I feel like I'm maybe speaking too much, but I had just one other kind of thing that I wanted to reflect on. And I think the second thing I think kind of addresses, I think tries to address the post-COVID question, but really through thinking about what COVID, I think, has taught us or has like stressed again to us about how homophobia works. So I think in my work, I've been really interested and grateful for those that try to think of homophobia not as like an individual act of violence or fear, or near simply as like a cultural thing, like, oh, you know, it's like a cultural thing, but as an economic and structural sort of thing that is like more organized perhaps. And so, and here I'm thinking about, I mean, this is like kind of name dropping, but like, because I really encourage people to read his work, is Rahul Rao's work, which kind of shows, sort of in my context, which shows kind of how international financial institutions supposedly combating homophobia in the global south are actually implicated in the very injustices they seek to oppose. And this is the kind of interesting thing that I think I really kind of want to think with further, by sort of enshrining forms of like material precarity and crisis within which actually homophobia thrives, and that actually make investments in heterosexuality, for example, such as the family unit, actually necessary for survival. So it kind of re-engineers the rationality behind homophobia, which is like the scary bit, but also maybe how we can like play, like sort of challenge it. And I think kind of like in terms of like disproportionately sort of impacting, I think, and this is something that Francesca and I have also sort of, I think we can both talk about this because of the project we worked on this year. But I think kind of disproportionately impacting classes of people who are already kind of systematically put in harm's way. I think COVID is yet another example of why we need to build solidarity across movements and between categories of people, not necessarily on their identities, but that actually share a history of marginalization by virtue of their normativity or non-normative economic, social, political, sexual, whatever practices. So kind of the importance of continuing to make that link between queer violence and capitalism. And again, this is something we can talk about, but I think this is also why this maybe is like a slightly tangential point, but like why looking at the queer forms of life that have emerged in these times of crisis, as Francesca and I have done, and we can talk about that, which kind of predate and will probably outdate this particular pandemic, which is also maybe why like I was like sort of thinking we should interrogate the temporality of this post-COVID designation, like post, do you know what I mean? What? I think that's also why sort of that can tell, looking at those kinds of forms of life can tell us something meaningful about life post-COVID. And I think I'm really interested in this question of like sort of queer people as being kind of interestingly placed to teach us something, because the fiction of this idea of a normal life and thus the return to normal life was always already kind of problematic, and like kind of what that does that even mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, those are my messy thoughts. I hope we can just start kicking us off the discussion.
I think there's a lot already there, and a lot of questions that I wanted to ask that you kind of already touched upon, which is really nice. So, and a lot of ideas that I kind of struggle with as well. But before I go into that, Francesca, perhaps you can just give us your kind of views and thoughts, and then.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation, Koen. And it's always nice to have a chat among friends and to be, on the panel with Olimpia. As she mentioned already, I'm just going to sort of, connect the dots a little bit. Olimpia and I worked last year out of boredom because of the lockdown, and out of curiosity, we started doing this digital ethnography of the Queer House Party, which was a super successful series of online Zoom parties for catering for the queer community, streaming from South London on Zoom every week throughout the first lockdown. And Olimpia and I were really fascinated, not just about the performance of these events, but also the broader implication that they had for creating some forms of solidarity and some forms of connectivity among queer people in a digital space. And that's how, some of the reflections that we're going to bring forward today, they come from because of the observations we made during that time, which was a very isolating, gloomy time for most queer people across the world, I would say. So not confined to the, to the UK by all means. But more broadly, also these considerations about the spatiality, I don't know, and temporality of, queer activism. So how space and time intersect with forms of creating forms of activism that are intelligible, both to the queer community itself, but also outside of the community. And we saw that during COVID, there was this proliferations of ways in which queerness and queer activism had to be reinvented, and the Queer House Party is one example. But as you mentioned, Koen, the amazing effort that went into creating World Pride streaming across the world last year. I followed all the streaming, and it was extremely fascinating and beautiful to see all the different contributions. So I think it forced us to look at a world in which space and time acquired a much different meaning for queer people. And we were always sort of under the impression that, there's always been these ideas, particularly with Pride events, that there's going to be more an exponential growth of Pride events. You're going to start with 1, and then you're going to have 5, and then in 5 years, you're going to have 10 and 12 and 15 and 20 and so forth. And COVID brought this sort of linear progression of time and progress to a very abrupt halt. And one of the thoughts that I was having most recently was how strong of an effect this has had exponentially or predominantly on those Pride events who were just sort of moving their first steps. So what I have in mind is, for instance, very small Pride events which probably started the year prior, 2019, imagine, or Pride events in rural places, Pride events in countries in which probably the legislation doesn't necessarily allow events to take place, but activists have sort of, defied bans, and, they haven't been able to build on that momentum because that momentum has actually been crushed by COVID. So this kind of sort of small actors within the Pride constellation, they have seen their sort of a trajectory to progression kind of crash and burn in a way. And I think, from a sort of an empirical perspective, it would be very interesting to see how they perceive this sort of stop in their course, and whether they see COVID as having any sort of impact in them, sort of sliding back in terms of what they thought they were doing within the community. Now, this being said, it's also true that these communities have often found online spaces as being super conducive of alternative ways of connecting. And not only they've done that, and Olimpia and I, we've done some work with the Queer House Party, they've even drafted people who would have normally not necessarily been able to participate to the same extent. And here we have, we have particularly in mind people who live in very remote localities, or people who do not necessarily know what's the queer scene around them, whose participation to Pride events probably was erratic, or had never happened, or they were not particularly confident being in a big group. But also people, and this is crucial, I think, is one of the main things that I think we can learn from the politics of Pride post-COVID, is that COVID brought to the forefront the question of access during Pride events. We never really engaged with that before. So, and I think it's pretty safe to say that most Pride events never thoroughly, or many queer spaces, leisure spaces, events, festivals, queer clubbing, they never really address the question of accessibility and inclusivity. And events such as the Queer House Party, but also, a more broader understanding of what happens when you move queer activism into the digital sphere, meant that people were really confronted with people with disabilities speaking up to their needs and asking, actually, now you can see us because we are in the, in the ether, we are online. And, once we've articulated our requests, then we are expecting you to organize events that are going to be more inclusive. And I think, it would be naive to probably say that there's going to be a huge change in this regard post-COVID. I mean, also, we can question the post-COVID temporality, because, Olimpia and I, we were just like, oh, COVID is going to be over, and then we're going to have a pre and post, but also, it's messy. Probably it's never going to be over. So what I was saying is that in regards to accessibility, probably it's naive to think that there's going to be a huge structural change in the way in which Pride events will be run. However, it is not unlikely that some particular forms of activism, which is intersectional, such as disability activism intersecting with queer activism, will definitely press for a more inclusive agenda. And I think there's also forms of other things that we've other reasons why we need Pride going forward. We need Pride events to continue to happen, is because of the question of accessibility, so creating intersectional spaces which cater for a variety of people. And I'm not even just thinking about accessibility or spaces that are actively anti-racist, anti-discriminatory towards trans prejudice or prejudice towards different minorities. But also, we kind of highlighted, this was done with you, Koen, the question of age. The question of age regarding the fact that young queer people, they've literally lost many of the homes that they used to inhabit, be them ideal homes or be them, clubbing spaces, Pride events, all sorts of situations in which they could safely explore their identities, sometimes away from homophobic families or peers. So, this has said the disproportionate, the halting of all this sort of the queer life in terms of leisure events and activism and socialization has had a tremendous impact on youth, on queer youth. So it's important that, we see Pride not because of the, the sort of tick in the boxes for, achieving necessarily just human rights. It's just that sort of catering to so many needs within the queer community, which cover, going out of isolation, creating forms of socialization that are safe, regardless of ability, age, race, ethnicity, religion, and gender identity, and sex, but also the question of resistance. So I think that there was a particular convergence last year, which has, in my opinion, has probably this is a little bit, of a big claim. So, feel happy to, be happy, feel free to dispute or to rebut what I'm about to say. That I think that the convergence between COVID and the events with Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd have sort of opened up a conversation within the organization of pride events that cannot be put back in a box going forward. So there we see across the world that there's a thorough engagement from activists with the ideas that pride should, in some cases, boot out police forces. So, sort of actively fight the militarization of pride events, see New York Pride. But also this idea that there is no queer justice without racial justice. And I think that this is coming through more and more, particularly from young activists. So there is going to be those tensions. There's going to be those generational tensions as well between, different segments of the queer community. But the intersection between the need for caring for your community due to COVID intersected with the need to listen to marginalized parts of the community, particularly Black people who've been, brutalized by the police and other institutions. I think that is a conversation that's going to have an impact. And it might not succeed, it may not be successful in the short run, but I cannot see how we can have, a politics of pride going forward, which does not at least try to answer those questions of care, of responsibility, and of anti-active, anti-racist. It's slightly different when it comes to trans issues, because I think there's a slightly more contested terrain, which is fueled by a very toxic conversation that very often oversights human rights and, descends in a very ideological sort of, discussion, which doesn't really help anyone. But, I think that is also on the agenda. And I think, the events with the backlash over trans rights have shown that, the LGBT community has to do a lot of work in order to not necessarily solve the tensions, because those tensions, in my opinion, unfortunately won't be solved because there's different souls, but at least address them in a way in which the human rights and the integrity of trans people and non-binary people will not be affected. But that also is very context specific. So, a country like the UK, Italy at the moment, they are, these sort of quote unquote gender wars are poisoning, many of the human rights debates we should have instead. I think I've overrun my time, so I'm just going to finish with this. And yeah, I think I've touched on all the things I wanted to say. So I'm just going to hand it over to you. Thanks, Koen.
Yeah, so this is what happens when we talk, because every time we talk, I have like questions I prepare, and then you actually take the words out of my mouth in the sense that you touched upon a lot of things I wanted to kind of have a conversation about, which is brilliant. But I mean, as you were talking, a couple of things that comes to my mind, like I'm thinking of the Pride Parade in Skopje, which happened this weekend, which was its second, and the first one was in 2019, Francesca, as you said, and it now happens again. Which seems to be also like a big success in the sense that people are so happy to finally be out again. But equally, I'm also thinking about last year in Albania, they had to cancel their, so I'm a specialist in Western Balkans, so that's why most of my examples come from there. But they kind of had to cancel their Pride, obviously, but then organized online Pride events, which were so liberating and so free, and people like suddenly, because there's a question about safety and pride. We assume often, I think when you come from like London Pride or the big Pride in the big cities, it's like a safety, like we assume safety is there, right? And I really appreciate as well, Francesca, what you're saying is that we can't like make this community as one community, because there is safety for a certain group of people within Pride, but then a lot of people, it's actually still a very unsafe space because of the kind of inequalities that you touched upon. And my kind of thinking was about these kind of virtual events, that they have a very different function to bringing people together. That is like cyberspace, because you can control who enters your space, it's a lot more safe. And it's a lot kind of conducive to that kind of community building, that kind of, or even just like self-exploration and kind of self-affirmation and that connection that we often don't have. But then equally, I'm wondering like what is lost, and the kind of, I think for me, when I think about what happened last year, is a re-invisibilization of these issues and the kind of taken for grantedness of straightness has come back. And I say straightvers do not refer to heterosexual relationships or so forth, but really the idea of fitting this very kind of coupled, very vanilla, very, very peculiar type of being together has kind of taken over. I think in almost every single place, the restrictions and the kind of way in which pandemic is dealt with was with the idea that you have a safe space, that you have a couple, that you have like your bubble, and then to people being that fall out, often queer people then are left alone dealing with that, and that kind of virtual space then provides a relief, right? And I'm quite curious to hear your thoughts on that kind of virtual space versus real life space, because that visibility is important, yet also really, for a lot of people, quite dangerous. It's a big commitment as who can be visible, and we tend to fetishize visibility as well as the kind of one and only solution. And I think that sometimes what Pride does is kind of make, oh yeah, that's visibility to do politics, and almost as if it kind of stops any other type of doing politics, which is not always the intention, but I think it kind of plays in there. So that's a question I kind of have, and but equally, then, you know, this kind of critique we have about corporations, what is their role, and I think it's a question about, as academics, and also why we are doing Pride. Like, is Pride a celebration of us, or is Pride like a demand for inclusion within the system, or are we going back, as you're saying, to Pride as a critique of the system? And I think, you know, that's that kind of shift. And I'm wondering to what extent, based upon what you're saying, we can like shift back from, I mean, if I think of like, you know, the Gay Liberation Front was a very systemic, non-identity, like a very kind of intersectional avant-garde way of analyzing oppression and kind of battle across the ways and the different forms of oppression, and kind of really systemic kind of activism, versus then moved in towards like a rights-based activism, identity-based activism. I'm wondering whether we're getting to this point where perhaps, because of, you know, what you say, Francesca, the Black Lives Matter, the killing of George Floyd, all of that coming together, the hatred for trans that's out there, which is a really vile kind of debate, which, I mean, in my head, it's not even a debate, it's just people spewing out prejudice. But are we going back there, right? But then it's interesting because it's really hard, because yes, we need that critique, that commercialization, that kind of puts us, that churns out that system critique. But when we just go blank out against it, we're also forgetting that people within these corporations are doing really hard work to carve their own safe space within this corporation. And this goes to your work, I guess, Olimpia. I mean, that work is often, they also kind of really fight really hard battles, put their kind of jobs at the line to fight against that internal structure. And if we then critique corporations putting their rainbow flag on their logos in the month of June and then forget about it for the next 11 months, if we like that kind of balance between being critical but also recognizing the human endeavor that comes into that, which I mean, there's a lot of questions that kind of come to my mind that you kind of all touched upon. I'm not quite sure what there is a question, but it's a lot of kind of thoughts that I'm thinking of, as well as a kind of, you know, the rural versus urban divide, which Francesca, you've done some work on as well. But I think we so often think of Pride as located in cities, located, like if you talk about Pride in a country, immediately think of like either the biggest city or the capital. But that again is a very, I mean, we know that urban queer life is very different than rural, and that kind of bridging that gap, and I mean, so much there that, I mean, there's a lot of questions there that are not really answered, so that you can't necessarily answer, but I'm also conscious of time. So I'm not quite sure whether I'm just throw it back or just also say, if anybody from the audience wants to ask questions or give us your kind of reflections, because I mean, it's really nice. A lot of names I recognize, and we've got Pride organizers, we've got academics, we've got activists. So it's a really nice kind of shared space. So if anybody wants to offer their reflections, feel free to raise your hand or mute yourself, join the discussion. But if like, so just do that. But in the meantime, yeah, I don't know, maybe I'll just pause for a second so people can gather their thoughts, or you can come in, Francesca or Olimpia.
Yeah, I mean, I think what both you said, I mean, I think it's like, it kind of, I'm going to say two things. I'm going to try. One is like really this kind of, this is why I'm an ethnographer, I guess, because this question of the virtual, like, what is the virtual? Like, what does it do? Is it super emancipative? Is it super oppressive? Like, I mean, obviously these are binaries and it's like way more complicated, but I think that those are exactly the kinds of questions sort of we should be asking. I mean, on the one hand, I am very seduced by the idea of the virtual as like, I mean, probably partly precisely because it has opened up these questions of accessibility in ways which me and Francesca have witnessed like firsthand, like sort of the ability to provide BSL interpretation was sort of not even sort of something within the realms of the imaginable in a club, whereas you now are able to sort of create a club, virtual club that has BSL interpretation and like a description and sort of, so in that sense, I am seduced by the idea of the virtual as like emancipative, but also like, I think this is something interesting. The two things that come to mind is also like one of like this, you know, the experience of like the virtual COVID life has been nothing but emancipative, probably the opposite of emancipative. So it's like, so yeah, what is lost? I also, what comes to mind is also maybe perhaps the private sphere as like the domain of heteronormativity. So what does it mean that like then now we're confined to our homes? I also, I think as someone who's fighting to open up like a queer space, like celebrating the virtual feels like particularly like kind of like, isn't that, what am I, you know, doesn't that go against the whole point of the campaign to like open actually like a physical space and also there and also working to make like that space accessible. So I think, I guess these are all questions that like, I guess relate to sort of why we did also the ethnographic work, which is like, I think the experience, perhaps the binary between the actual and the virtual is itself can be like messed with, but also like experiences are so sort of diverse. On your point about the kind of role of multinational, we have a question, so I'm kind of mindful of being quite quick. But yeah, I mean, you kind of articulated perfectly, like, you know, we can't, like, there are people within these corporations. I guess to me, what the fascinating thing is that they're actually genuinely like, you know, you can't say, oh, actually, sorry, Lisa Duggan says you're like not supposed to be happy about this. Like that is not the kind of work that we try to do, like theoretically in our academic work to sort of, so I guess my problem is more with systems rather than within the individuals. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm gonna stop there and pass it on to Francesca.
I'm just going to be super quick, and I want to address the question of invisibility and sort of, you know, what has it done to visibility? Is it visibility a good or bad thing? Should we aim for invisibilization when people want it? So the first thing is that the narrative of life under COVID, you know, what the endurance of COVID, the trauma of COVID has been very heteronormative. And there has been almost virtually no space in the mainstream narratives to acknowledge queer life, queer affect. And I'm thinking in particular, the so-called sex ban, for instance, is we're not even going to kid ourselves. That has disproportionately affect queer affect and queer relationships. And also there has been such a huge trail of devastation in queer life because of, you know, what has happened. You know, think about people who worked in the arts, in the creative industries, and this is not to create a stereotype, but, you know, a lot of queer people have different avenues to sustain themselves, which may not be traditional. Think about sex workers. A lot of the people doing Queer House Party, they were sex workers who had lost their job, or the avenues where they would, you know, earn their work, their sort of, you know, their salaries. So I think that the narrative has been one of making queer life going back into the closet. Oh, and so coming out of this closet because of COVID into a virtual space, let's not kid ourselves, has been safe for heterosexual, heteronormative, you know, standards, because they didn't have to put up with us in the real world. Has it been good for queer people? Probably. Is it the best thing for queer people? I doubt it. it's a tool. I think, you know, it's funny for me, it took me weeks to realize what IRL meant. You know, there wasn't such an acronym before. So IRL, oh, in real life. I mean, that wasn't just, you know, standard. So what I'm trying to say is that we now have a different tool. We may use this tool for different things. For instance, for exploring safely certain identities or feelings or things, or connecting with people far away in a gradual way, not having to show up at a bar or an event. However, Olimpia and I, and I'm just going to close with this observation, when we were doing this ethnography and when we presented some of the findings of this research, we were asked by others, you know, about safety and, you know, how do you protect the anonymity of people, you know, showing up. And there was someone already, I think, Tunay Altay, he did a paper on a similar party in Turkey, and he was really worried about protecting the identities of the participants. So, you know, the question of the virtual space is not one deprived of criticalities in relation to safety either. And particularly, you know, with the idea of, you know, being able to take screenshots or record what you're doing on the other side of the screen, this sort of voyeuristic element that kind of, you know, poses all sorts of ethical questions for us as researchers, but also for queer people in places in which it's not safe to be queer. So the virtual is only useful insofar as it doesn't put people at risk. What is the extent of that happening? It depends.
Yeah, I think those are really valid points, and they're really important points to make. Jamie, I know you've been waiting for a very long time for your question, so thanks for your patience.
It's fine, don't worry. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear all of you speak. Let me just put my hand down. Yeah, I think it's not so much questions, I suppose, as just various reflections, because as all of you were speaking, I was just kind of like ping, 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 like just this stuff is kind of generating in my head. It was honestly amazing. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I want to talk about, you've talked about quite a lot, the difference between the physical and the virtual. And I'm fascinated to read your findings about Queer House Party, because I'm involved in research at the moment, which has been affected by the pandemic. And I just, yeah, and you just gave such a brilliant kind of example of, oh, great, thanks, Ria. You gave such a great kind of account of its benefits. And I just wanted to hear if there was anything that was kind of not right with it, because I've been interviewing gay men specifically, queer men, I suppose is more accurate to say. And it's not been great, the simply virtual life. So I suppose the interesting thing is gonna, as you've been saying in this discussion, and so it will be interesting to see how this Zoom life exists, kind of whatever post-pandemic means. And I just a couple of other things, I suppose, about I suppose Francesca's claim about accessibility and these and nightlife, which I think are largely true, and I largely agree with what you're saying. But I'm just thinking of a couple of events that I went to, a Pride event, London Pride, and also Hackney Carnival, which both had queer people of colour stages. And both of which were obviously organised by very kind of politically informed people, because those spaces were accessible and there were signs kind of everywhere explaining about issues of disability, issues of how to address queer people for any straight people that were there. And I think there were ways of, and in very small and minor spaces, interestingly, both queer people of colour spaces, where the kind of issues that you're talking about were addressed. So that I wonder if it is significant that these are kind of cutie pop spaces. Perhaps it is. And the other thing was that, yes, there wasn't a Pride last year, obviously, but there was a Black Trans Lives Matter march, which was conducted with no kind of consequences as far as we can tell when it came to COVID spreading. And I think that's really significant. I mean, this isn't a rebuttal of anything any of you have said, but that fascinated me. And also in Brooklyn, I think there was a hugely organised and highly mediatized kind of Black Trans Lives Matter, and that was fascinating. That, you know, we couldn't organise Pride, and kind of as a consequence of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, that Black Trans Lives Matter has become such a visible presence in queer culture and what that meant in terms of Pride. So yeah, it is more reflections than a question. But thank you. It's been amazing, really.
Thanks, Jamie. These are really, really great reflection points. And I mean, I can't take property of semi-chair, even though I'm not actually chair, but to kind of reflect on I think, you know, for me, what I found really fascinating is within a pandemic, Emil, I'll come to your points in a sec. Within a pandemic where being out in group was unsure whether it was actually safe in a health perspective, right? We saw a rise of protest. And I also really, I didn't mention in the intro, but I was thinking when I was preparing for this talk, I was like, it's also really fascinating to see that the first Pride event that occurred back in London was this weekend, the Trans Pride, which was a protest march, right? And whether protest is coming back in that kind of effort, it seems, especially for those marginalized people, that protest part of the Pride is coming really important. And I don't want to say that Pride in this other way is not a protest, right? It's always a protest, but in different forms. But I think that kind of really, to me, stands out. The rest I'll leave to Olimpia, Francesca. I'm also conscious of time, so do you mind if I just let Emil come in and then you can address them together? This is where prerogative of chair comes in. Sorry, Emil.
Thanks, I'll be quick. Thanks a lot, all of you, and thanks for organizing this. This is super interesting. This relates to what you said, Koen, about the protest and the kind of re-emergence, or perhaps of protest or Pride as a protest event. The critique against commercialization has been and is a lot of, as I read it, a lot of about its depoliticizing effects, that it depoliticizes a very political event, or an event that should be and has been political. And this reflection or question comes from the Swedish context. I don't know to what extent it's valid elsewhere, but I've been thinking about how we see several forms of repoliticization of Pride today, and in Sweden it would be, I mean, the rise of the radical right wing, of anti-gender movements. In Sweden, just say 5 years ago, everybody wanted to be part of Pride. The nationalists wanted to be part of Pride. The right wing, the left, everyone. I mean, it was really this very apolitical or depoliticized event. Whereas now, the right wing or parts of it, where they gain power locally, they ban rainbow flags. They don't want to be part of Pride because they see it as a left-wing radical indoctrination. So in a way, this, I think, is repoliticizing Pride, at least in the Swedish context, and making it more controversial, perhaps. I'm thinking if this is something we are seeing elsewhere, and what does that do with the critique of depoliticization?
Thanks, Emil. I'm going to be quiet because otherwise I talk way too long. So, Francesca, Olimpia.
You raised a lot of interesting questions. I'm going to try and sort of combine the reflections by Jamie and Emil in a way. And by the way, I'm going to put the link, if that's okay. The Pink News just published a piece where I did an interview with them precisely on these issues and some of the issues that we raised. And one of the issues that I raised with them is this idea that there is a growing significance of grassroots democratized forms of Pride organization. For instance, I'm going to give you an example. In Italy, the city of Bologna, there's a huge number of organizations spanning from migrants' rights to sex workers, trans activists, the mainstream LGBT groups. They have organized what they're gonna call Rivolta Pride, which is basically openly anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-establishment, trans-feminist Pride event. So that, for me, is definitely a sign of what is the future for Pride, because we always have this assumption that Pride is this unitary container, it's one container where you can shove everything inside. However, the last few years have shown us with more trans pride, more, different UK Black Pride, sort of different pride, traveler pride, para pride, all these different prides catering for different segments, that pride is one out of the many options. For instance, I'm talking, for instance, Pride London, or the national prides in Italy, different pride. But what prevents people from organizing alternative marches? What prevents someone from organizing a Black Trans Lives Matter out of a spur of the moment? So I think that it's very exciting for people to take ownership of the narrative of pride. And I agree with all of you when you say that protest is coming back, because probably we rested on laurels, particularly, in those countries in which, the narrative of also institutionalization of the LGBT movements and of, narratives of commercialization, homonationalism have sort of saturated the space of political participation. But there are probably people, and I think particularly younger people, now they realize that the fight is not over. It's never been for them or for other minorities, and they're gonna probably push back for a diversification of pride. And that for me is one of the most exciting developments. So why one Pride London instead of 10, 12, 15, one pride for each neighborhood? That would be great.
I don't think I've got anything to add to that, because I think it's, yeah, let's do that. I mean, I guess, I don't know, maybe some reflections. I mean, I went to Rome Pride. So my experiences of London Pride and Rome Pride are also very different. Like in London, I can be like very angry about corporations. In Rome, I'm like, oh my God, yes. Like I can be queer at home. Awesome. Which is also like a very interesting experience. Like, cause I think we also experience perhaps different prides in different places in different ways because of like what that place means to us in relation to our queer identity. So I definitely find myself like being way more nostalgic and like, in Rome, or perhaps in Italy. Francesca's nodding, maybe she agrees. But I think what I also like about Rome Pride, for example, and I think this is like where we go back to sort of a structural issue in terms of like the London Pride, is like in Rome Pride, you don't have to pay, sort of, I think it relates to what Francesca was saying. You don't have to like, you can just show up with your banner and your mates, and like, you can be as political as you can kind of say whatever you want. And so in a sense, like, I think, is that related to what Francesca was saying in terms of sort of one, not necessarily one pride containing many prides, but it was like, who's stopping you from sort of showing up with your own banner and like shouting, your own slogans and your own things. And it's a very interesting kind of experience, because that allows for this kind of mixing and also like kind of sharing and like maybe coming up against perhaps, there was like a lot of young people who were very confused by some of the sort of more old school, like sort of, singing Bella Ciao, which is like a traditionally like kind of left-wing song, and they didn't see the relevance of that, but there was like a few exchanges. So I think there are spaces to sort of make it more democratic in that sense. And that's really exciting, not just because it allows spaces to sort of, in the fixity of it, because it allows spaces for people to sort of participate, but precisely I think what I'm actually particularly interested in is like those kind of those connections or points of like coming up against people that perhaps in neighborhoods perhaps that wouldn't necessarily sort of attend the London Pride, but now it's there at their doorstep. So, and what does that create? I think that's something I find interesting, and how it like completely like explodes perhaps our notion of pride, that it happens in June, that it's one day, that it takes place in Trafalgar Square, like kind of what even is, I think that's perhaps my issue with pride more than anything, of like, why is it one thing? Yeah, exactly. But yeah, and I think I particularly liked, I mean, maybe this is kind of related, but Emil's point of like sort of deep, it's not depoliticization. I think I have an issue with this idea of depoliticization, because it assumes that like what is happening is not also deeply political, and it's not literally just one like kind of very specific kind of form of perhaps individualizing and privatizing politics, but it's still apolitics. Yeah, so I mean, those are just my thoughts on what you've been saying, but yeah, this has been a really sort of amazing discussion. Thank you. I'll pass that over to Koen.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like, if there's any other people with some question, I'm really concerned. I mean, we can run over a little bit, but so if you have another question, do raise your hand. It's kind of now or never, almost kind of a game show moment where it's whatever. Anyway, that didn't go anywhere. But I mean, I do like the idea of the kind of localized prides. I'm thinking, like, I mean, London is such a big city, and the kind of, I mean, I enjoy going to the center and drinking with some of my friends and getting absolutely drunk and just not remembering most of what happened that day. But I'm thinking as well, like, if I mean, when I think where I live, like, there's never actually a connection with local queers unless through some of the apps, which is again a virtual space that we haven't even talked about, like the app sphere, which is a very non-affectionate, very distant virtual space where there's connection that's not connection. So that kind of, which I really liked your point earlier about the effectiveness, and I think like physical connection is so important. Yes, we can be safe online, but that, I mean, I'm thinking, I'm so tired of seeing people on screens. There's so many friends of mine on this screen that I think I just want to be able to have a chat and see you and feel your presence, the energy of your presence. And so I think that local kind of, I imagine if you had local prides in Lewisham or local prides in wherever, it would be so nice to actually get a community locally and root yourself in a big city like London. But anyway, that's maybe my own personal topic when thinking at the moment, which is nice because usually I'm quite pessimistic. So
there's actually a gay bar right by your house now, Koen, if you don't know it.
Oh, really?
Lewisham.
We have to go then. But anyway, on that note, I think we're kind of at the end of the hour. Maybe we shouldn't have gone for an hour, but anyway, I want to just thank you all for being here, for the interventions as well. It's been a really interesting discussion. I enjoyed it a lot. I hope you did as well. If you want to stay in touch, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to chat over Twitter, Instagram, email, whatever. And hope to see many of you in real life at some point. And on that note, I think that's the end. So thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely evening. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Olimpia's gone.
Well, she had a meeting to go to.
Yeah. That went well, right? What do you think?
Well, Hannah, what do you think?
It was really great. Yeah, you touched on so many really important points, especially just at the last year's Pride as well. So yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. Thank you for your really, really good discussions.
Thank you, Koen, for the invitation.
Oh, hang on, I forgot to. Hang on, I'm gonna